Okay. Excuse me there. Good afternoon, Avian Science. I hope everybody had a good spring break last week and you're back and ready to start learning more about birds.
I didn't get that meme or whatever what that was. Was that a meme?
I think it was just a joke.
Every time I close my eyes, it's just there and standing there hissing at me. There's a goose in the room with us now.
Yep.
Okay.
The woman is supposedly laying on the psychiatrist's couch, and the psychiatrist is assuming that the goose is hallucinatory, and I don't know, it seemed funny to me, but
Wow.
I
was like, where did this goose come from all of a sudden?
I think
I just need to know the backstory. Like it's weird. I'm weird like that. Like my a coworker did this to me the other day. He like made a comment or he was like talking about something, and I'm like, all right, let me just ask. And it was like some joke or something, and I was like, all right, I gotta go like all like mathematical on this, and I had to have him like explain it like it was an equation. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, I think the
I was like,
idea
okay,
is
so where does the goose come from? Like,
you're supposed to be reading the comment in the first panel thinking that she's describing a nightmare to the psychiatrist, and then the second panel, the joke is that she's talking about a goose, not a nightmare.
oh, okay.
Some people are afraid of geese. All right, so announcements. So the assignments that got posted during spring break are due.
9 Osted. Your short quiz and short answers to be 9 Osted Friday.
Oh, I see it. Okay, yeah. Sorry about that. Not even looking at that part yet. I'm still over here on the left. So there is some stuff that's due on Friday this week on March 24th, including if you haven't gotten your topic request in or your format request in, those need to be in as by this Friday. New assignments will be posted on Friday. There will be a quiz and a short answer, and those will be due next Friday on March 31st. All right, so we're going to start off having a brief look at conures. So we've talked about parrots already. So we've got some ideas about what their personalities are like and the good and the bad of them. So conures are smaller parrots. So they have some similarities to the bigger parrots, especially in personality, but in a smaller and shorter lived package. So there's a bunch of different species that get called conures. Different individual species are going to have slightly different behaviors. We're just doing a general overview. Like the parrots, these guys can be loud. This particular species, the sun conure, is one of the louder conures. They can achieve volumes similar to or as loud as the larger parrots. So just because they're smaller does not guarantee a little more peace and quiet around the house. Just like the big parrots, these are very intelligent birds. They need a lot of emotional stimulation. They need a lot of mental stimulation, and they tend to be highly playful and interactive. Now, one of the big advantages to these over the larger parrots is that their lifespan is significantly shorter. If you remember, the big parrots' lifespans tended to be between 40 to 100 years. These guys, it's more like 20 to 40. So you're not having to put them in the will for your grandparents to take, your grandchildren to take care of them. Now, we didn't really talk about this with the big parrots, but when we talk about actual longevity in captivity, it's about 10 years. We've seen this with parakeets. We see it a lot with the parrots. Life expectancy for a lot of these pet birds in captivity is about half as long as their potential life expectancy. So it's very, very common for these birds. Basically, most captive raised birds tend to have shorter lifespans than we would like to see. And a lot of that is related to poor nutrition and poor husbandry. These birds are sometimes referred to as parakeets. Remember, parakeet in American terms tends to refer to budgies, but there are a lot of different species of smaller parrots, including the budgies, and things like the pocket parrots, the conures, and a bunch of other related smaller parrots. They get lumped into this parakeet category. So if somebody describes a green-winged parakeet, it's a smaller parrot. It may or may not be a conure. We're going to talk about the two major groups of conures, because they do have some differences between these two groups. The Aratinga conures are the conures pictured here. So we've got the sun conure. Here's a cherry-headed, the Nande, the Jende. These guys are like all of the conures we're going to talk about today, from South America. They tend to be between 12 and 15 inches long. So they're a little longer than a sheet of paper, because this is 11.5 inches. So just a little bit bigger than that. They need lots of space, just like all parrots do. So they either need a sizable aviary or they need free flight in the house. So just like the parrots, they can have a bedtime cage, but they need time outside of their cage. This group has the really colorful sun and Jende conures. People are attracted to these bright colors. But that they don't seem to realize how noisy these birds are going to be, because these groups, the sun conures, the Jende, and the Nande conure, are well known for being really, really loud. Remember,
if you're at the back of a store and the bird's at the front of the store in a different room, you can hear it in that room from the back of the store.
Oh, I believe it. Absolutely. Absolutely. These are native to jungle habitats, so they've got to be loud to be in contact with the rest of the flock. And so at home or at the pet store, they'll often scream to try and get attention or to get in contact with the rest of the flock. And when they're in captivity, their flock largely consists of people. Now, these guys, I have heard this term pronounced so many different ways. I have no idea what the correct pronunciation is. Purhura conures. Purhura conures, again, mostly South American. Some of these are from Central America. There are a lot more species than what are pictured here, but you'll notice they don't have any of that bright yellow and orange of the sun or Day conures. They tend to be a little less flashy than those. They're also a little smaller at about 10 inches. Just like the other parrots, they need time out of their cage. Any large or a large indoor aviary. The Perhura conures are the group that I think is better suited for captivity. They're not as loud as the Aratinga conures. They don't call as often as the Aratinga conures, but they still are very social. They still need a lot of attention. They are intelligent like the other parrots. They need that stimulation you get with the other parrots. This is the option I tend to recommend for someone who wants a parrot after I've tried to convince them not to get a parrot. Because let's be honest, even these guys, they're challenging pets. The advantage to the conures, this is a green cheek conure. You can hold it in your hand.
That one looks fairly young.
It's hand reared. It's a little bit young, but it's fully grown. I'm going to answer the chat question in just a second. So these guys tend to like cuddles. So they like a lot of physical contact, which some of the bigger parrots do and some don't. But they have that parrot tendency to feather pluck if they're not getting enough stimulation. And while the Perhura conures are more likely to bite, in fact, all the conures are more likely to bite than the larger parrots. It can hurt, it'll break your skin, but it will not break your bones. So the question in the chat, Quaker parrots and lorikeets. So the conures that we're talking about here are all American species, Central and South American species. If I remember right, I don't remember off the top of my head where Quakers are native to, but they don't fit into either of these two categories, although they are in the overarching parrot group. Lorikeets are Australian. They're an oddball group of birds. So even though they're in the parrot group, they are nectivores. So they eat nectar like hummingbirds do in this country, which makes them a little messier than other parrots. I mean, all parrots are messy. Don't get me wrong. They're all messy, but because they eat this, or at least part of their diet is this liquid diet, that has to be monitored very closely so it doesn't grow bacteria, because their liquid diet will grow bacteria very easily if you're not careful. So I can't quite answer that question, but Quakers and lorikeets, neither one of them fall into either of these conure categories. Yep, conures like to do things like that. I can picture them getting in the back of a hood. Absolutely. All right, so hopefully at this point, we've talked about a couple of different groups of birds, and we're starting to get the idea that when we talk about anything that gets in the parrot category, we're going to see the same sets of challenges with these birds. And we're going to see a lot of people who really should not have these birds who do have these birds, because they can't meet the bird's needs very well. So hopefully you're starting to realize that it takes a special person to own a parrot and do it well. Okay, so that's the conure discussion. I just wanted to introduce those guys. That's kind of the way the different groups that are still to be discussed in this class are going to go largely. I'm not going to go through, you know, the diet for each individual group or the aging requirements for each individual group. I'm going to be talking about what makes them distinct from here on. Except chickens. I think we have a lecture scheduled on chickens, and that's completely different than the parrots. So the next topic I wanted to talk about here is evolution. So I'm not going to go over a big lecture on evolution. If you've taken a general bio class, you've probably gotten that lecture before. Kinley, I've gotten a lot of emails. If you sent it over the break, I may not have answered it yet.
Yeah, it was an email about what I want to do at the bird project. Have you not seen that one yet?
I think I've seen it, but I think I had over 50 messages at the end of the break, so I'm working my way through it. Most of them are junk. I've seen that it's in there though, so I will get to that, and I will do that after class. I'll make myself a note.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. All right. So we're not going to go over the typical details of evolution. We're going to talk about one type of evolution that is more commonly seen in birds than in other types of animals. And we're going to talk about some of the changes that happen between what we call dinosaurs and what we call modern birds. So evolution is defined as a change in a species over generations. So we're not talking about a change in an individual, we're talking about changes in the entire species, and it takes relatively long periods of time. How long? Okay, Ronit, I think I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Does the definition include the changes due to pressures, or is it just changes?
It's just changes. Because some of these changes happen due to chance. Changes that happen due to pressure are certainly the more powerful and more common forms of evolution, but there are some forms that happen just kind of randomly. We'll talk about that briefly a little bit later on. Okay, so how long it takes for a species to evolve depends on how fast they reproduce. Mosquitoes can evolve really quickly. They can have multiple generations in a year. But elephants, well, it takes them a long time to mature. They don't have many offspring. Each offspring requires a lot of attention and time. So it's going to take a lot longer for them to evolve. Generally speaking, smaller physically sized organisms usually have a faster reproductive rate, and so they are going to evolve quicker.
But what about like just specifically birds? Like the
specifically,
smaller birds. It's like, okay, so let's say
it,
a hawk
it's
isn't gonna
not,
have as many as a
okay, yep, I
Blue
get
jay.
that, I get that. It's,
offspring. There we go.
it's largely true for most birds. So large birds like albatross and, like you said, hawks and eagles, but also large macaws, crows, surprisingly, and ravens. They don't reproduce as fast as things like blue jays or sparrows or goldfinches or anything like that. So yeah, we're going to think the smaller bird species, generally speaking, are going to have a faster reproductive rate.
And that can also be genetic. Like, is there such thing as genetic evolution?
I'm not quite sure. Evolution is changes. There, genetics and evolution are tightly work together. So we're going to get to that
Okay,
in maybe 15 minutes.
cool.
All right. So we've talked about species. We talked about the different species of parrots and the different species of this, that, and the other. When we look at different bird species, they are all related by common ancestry. So at some point, there was a common ancestor, a species that was the common ancestor to all existing birds. And we look at the evolution, one of the tools that we use to describe these evolutionary relationships are taxonomy and how we name things. So we're going to get to that in the next slide. The last thing I want to say on this slide, and this is something that a lot of people don't think about, but traits or characteristics, things that make a blue jay, can be gained or lost over generations. So we tend to think about you evolve a new characteristic, but you can lose things. So at some point, a long, long time ago, our ancestors had tails. We don't have tails. We have structures in the bottom of our spine that are remnants of the tail that we have modified through evolution for different purposes. But we have the evidence of those tails still in our bodies today. Flightless birds is a perfect example. Ostriches, emus, my beloved ray tights used to fly. Penguins, their ancestors flew, but they don't now. Okay, so when we talk about taxonomy and naming, taxonomy is a way of, it's figuring out and describing species and that species' relationship with other species. So I'm going to make it sound much simpler than it is. We organize names of animals into a bunch of different names of all living things into various categories. So this is a typical hierarchy shown here. It's not completely up to date. We have a category called domain, which is the largest category. There are only 3 domains. So the domains are bacteria. So all bacteria are in the domain bacteria. There's the domain eukarya. Eukarya is defined based on characteristics of cells, and eukarya includes plants, animals, and fungi. And then there's another category called archaea. Not really going to talk about that. Those are single-celled organisms that are not bacteria. So that should be at the top. So every plant, every animal, every fungus is all in the same domain. If we want to look at just animals, we are all in the same kingdom. That's the level that we're all in. So the kingdom Animalia. And that includes any organism. I'm going to give you my simple definition. Animals, multicellular, capable of moving under their own control at some stage in life. That is my big, easy definition of the kingdom Animalia. I've heard much more detailed definitions, but this is the one I like because it really helps you understand. If you look at a fish, fish is moving. If you look at a snail is moving. Apes are animals. So yes, apes and humans and birds, insects, all mammals, they're all going to be in the group Animalia. Now, I'm not going to, I might ask you about the kingdom Animalia. I'm not going to ask you about phylum, class, order, or family. Those are just kind of intermediate levels. So we can get to the point where we only talk about organisms that have a backbone, of vertebra. And then we can talk about just mammals, and then we can talk about just carnivores, and then we can talk about the canids. We can also add layers in between. And sometimes the class Mammalia might be too restrictive, but we want to, kind of take mammals and maybe mammal related animals and put those in a category, and we put it in between phylum and class. Yes, it is. It's the nightmare. Subclasses, super orders, all those subcategories. We're kind of.
Also, what on earth is the difference between a subclass and a superorder? This is like when a single black key on a piano has 2 different names.
Yes. Yeah, there's a subtle difference, but yeah, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous.
Does anyone actually know what it is?
Subtle, but like not there.
Taxonomists know the difference.
There's a
The
reason
rest
I
of us,
one.
I like to use cladistics, where we put everything in clades, and the clades don't have specific orders where they go. So we would say the clade of birds, the clade of ratites, and we can use that for any of these different categories. One of the big reasons we're not doing all the layers in between kingdom and genus, because the last 2 are very useful, genus and species. These are the Okay, I know you're going to call me out on this because there are subspecies and varieties, but generally speaking, genus and species is going to be the most specific category. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. As far as birds go, we can put all birds in the same group. Like I said, I like to call it a clade. It's technically a class on the old system, and that's aves or aves. So to talk about genus and species, these terms are how scientists describe the specific species they're talking about. So scientists don't tend to use common names. So they usually are not going to say cardinal. You guys all know what a cardinal is, right? You know what the northern cardinal is. There are other cardinals. We know
Cardinal from the north.
Yeah, the cardinal from the north, but there are cardinals from other parts of the world that look different.
Ernie, that's such your state bird of Ohio.
Yeah. There's an American robin and there's a European robin. They're not even in the same category. They're completely different birds. But Americans, what we call a robin, if we went to Europe, we would not recognize the European robin as a robin. So common names get confusing. So scientists use genus and species. And I try and describe this as genus is similar to your last name. Organisms within the same genus are closely related to each other, but are not the same species. So my last name is Davis, and in my Davis genus would be Zach, my nephew, Harry, my father, Virginia, my grandmother. So we're all related, but we're different individuals. And species is the equivalent of your first name. So I am the species of Diana. Now, when we're really talking about genus and species, you know, everybody in the same species is breeding together, and there's more than one individual. But I think that the last name, first name idea kind of helps you understand this, how specific, the different levels of specificity here. So all cassowaries are in the genus Casuaris. Every cassowary is in the genus Casuaris. And we put the genus first and the species second. So the southern cassowary is Casuaris casuaris. So good, they named it twice. So that is the first species described in that genus. That's not always the case if you see a double name like that. There's also a northern cassowary, Casuarius unappendiculatus. That refers to the wattle. So the southern cassowary has a double wattle that's hanging down from the neck there. Unappendiculatus means it's lacking one of those wattles. And then there's Casuarius bennetii, named after somebody named Bennett, obviously. And that's the third species. Okay. Generally, I'm going to use common names in this class because I'm not going to force you to memorize a whole bunch of scientific names, but I want you to understand why we use them, and the type of information we can get from the scientific name. We use them because the scientific name casuarius is the same in English, French, Russian, Swahili, you name it, it's the same for any language. It's the one name for that species. And the information we get is everything that's casuarius is in the same genus, so these birds are all closely related to each other. Okay, so that's nomenclature or naming system. So we defined evolution in changes over generations. So why does evolution happen? Well, the big one is nature is not stable. We tend to, think of this idea that the way the world is, the way the natural environment is today is the way it's been, and it will forever be that way. That's just not the case. We can talk about climate change. Climates change over relatively long periods of time naturally. The important part there is relatively long periods of time, because it takes time for species to evolve to catch up with climates that are changing. What we currently call climate change or global warming is happening because of things that people have done. And it's happening so fast that most species are not able to keep up by evolving fast enough. So if you imagine the climate is getting warmer on average most places in the world. So the kinds of trees, if you drive up to Maine, you notice that there's a lot more evergreen trees, not very many broadleaf or deciduous trees. So those evergreen trees are more adapted to very cold climates. Unfortunately, as climate change progresses, the areas that get cold enough in winter that allow those evergreens to thrive and that prevent deciduous trees from growing, that area is moving further north. We see this in all kinds of species. Trees cannot move very fast. So that's a big concern. Birds have the advantage that a lot of them are already migratory, and so they can move faster. The problem we're seeing with birds and modern day climate change, this is supposed to be talked about later in the semester. Let me get off my climate change soapbox. So natural climate change happens and it triggers evolution. We can also get new food supplies. A new plant moves into the area. A new insect moves into the area or evolves. We can have new predators. Again, they can be moving into the area. I haven't heard recently about the eagle owl that's been spotted in Maine and California on the East Coast that's normally native to parts of Russia and some of the islands off the coast of Alaska. But I know it had been hanging around for a good year. If another one shows up and they decide to nest, they can establish a new population and you get a new predator in that area. We can also have loss of food supplies or predators, which are going to change the forces acting on a specific species. I was talking about the eagle, sea eagle. It's a sea eagle that's been showing up there. So I was talking about the sea eagle moving in. So you can have a species that moves into a new area. And of course, we can also have new diseases and new parasites. New diseases and new parasites are very, very strong drivers of evolution. So these are a very important force in pushing evolution. Basically, when we're talking about nature, change is the only constant. What evolution does not do it does not move in a specific direction. We tend to think of evolution as making organisms more complicated, but it doesn't always. This is going back to losing traits. So we can talk about birds losing the ability to fly, but we can also talk about cave fish and cave dwelling animals that used to have eyes, and now they've evolved not to, because eyes are energetically expensive. It takes a lot of food to make them and use them. And if you live in the darkness all the time, they're not doing you any good. So that's an example of moving in the direction that we would consider backwards. We see sometimes organisms becoming simpler rather than more complex. Evolution does not create traits an organism needs. So it might be really, really good for, I know most of my examples here are not in birds, and I apologize for that. COVID. Wouldn't it be great if we could suddenly start being immune to COVID? It'd be a major advantage. COVID's causing a lot of disruption, lots of deaths, but evolution will not create that. Evolution acts on pre-existing characteristics. It does not create new characteristics. And evolution does not make things perfect. So it doesn't perfect an organism. My example for this one is childbirth. Childbirth in humans is very, very difficult and dangerous. Before modern medicine, and you can see this is years on the x-axis and rate of maternal mortality, so mothers dying during childbirth. Wouldn't that count as mutation if it was a rapid change to adapt or change to something? Mutations themselves are random. So the raw material of evolution are the pre-existing genetic changes. Evolution just selects for the ones that are advantageous, that are beneficial or good for the species. I hope that answers your question there. So it used to be that 1 out of every 100 or 200 births resulted in a maternal death. Oh man, you guys just keep jumping in and asking questions today. That's great. Evolution happens through mutations, yes. Behavior that is passed on to young is not evolution, that's culture. So that's a difference there, because anything, a genetic mutation that gets passed on can get passed on even if the young are not raised by their parents. But a behavior has to be taught from the previous generation to the new generation. That's the difference between those two.
So why isn't pressure necessarily involved?
Okay,
The mutations are random, but the ones that survive.
right. All right. So for most cases of evolution, there is pressure. Yes, absolutely. But there are situations, things that are called genetic drift, or something called the founder effect, that can cause evolution to happen without pressure. So genetic drift is when there is a trait or characteristic that is not harmful to the species and not beneficial to the species. It's neutral as far as cost benefit analysis. But by chance, it might become more common in the species and eventually be a defining characteristic of that species. By chance. A lot of times this will happen when there's a situation where you have a major environmental disaster. So you have a volcanic eruption, and say you've got a species of mouse that lives on the volcano, and half the population gets wiped out and the other half survives, and the half that survives by random chance has more individuals who are spotted than plain coded. So then we get evolution without the selective pressure. Does that help? Okay, great. Okay. Human mortality. It used to be about 1 maternal death for every 100 to 200 births. So imagine that. For every 100 people born, one of them had lost their mother at or shortly after birth. Today in the United States, the rate is 1 per 30,000 live births. So it's much, much better. Although that's the overall rate, the African American death rate, maternal mortality rate, is twice that seen in white Americans. African Americans do not get as good health care as white Americans do. And we can compare that to Australia, where the mortality rate is 1 per 50,000. So the US is not doing good compared to other wealthy countries anyway. And some subpopulations are doing quite a bit worse. All right. So in order for evolution to happen, and for this list of requirements we are going to be talking through, we are talking about the more traditional thinking of evolution, not just things like, not weird things like genetic drift. So there has to be variation within the species. That variation has to be passed on to the next generation. Resources have to be limited and there is competition for them. These resources can be a lot of different things, including mates. Survival and reproduction varies. So some individuals are more likely to survive and be able to reproduce. And if they have a genetic difference that makes them more likely to survive, that's what evolution is going to act on. So let's walk through these. Variations within a species occur due to genetic mutations. A mutation is any change in the genetic code. So this is beta carotene up here. And in canaries, there was a mutation in a gene. We're not going to worry about what that gene was, that caused beta carotene to change into xanthine. Whew. I should have practiced that one before this. Xanthine. And you can see, I mean, probably most of you won't realize what this is. This is an extra molecule of oxygen on each one of these ring structures of this molecule. And when you have that extra oxygen on the ring structure, instead of looking yellow, it looks red. So this is the pigment, and there was a gene mutation that changed the color of the pigment. For evolution to act, these genetic mutations must be in what is called the germline. The germline are the cells that produce eggs or sperm. You could have a genetic mutation on the tip of your nose. That is never going to get passed on to your offspring. It's only going to get passed on if it's in your ovary or your testes. When we look at genetic mutations, many have no effect. They just have no effect. If I have a genetic mutation that, let's say I have a genetic mutation in a cell in my liver that codes for red hair, I'm not going to become a redhead because that cell is in my liver. Most genetic mutations act this way. There's just no effect. If there's an effect, it's usually harmful. It is the relatively rare mutation that is beneficial. I say relatively rare because let's think about this. In newly produced sperm, we have good numbers for sperm. 1 in every 1,000 sperm has a new genetic mutation, a mutation that is not going to be seen in the parent, in the person with the testes. Males in general produce billions of sperm in their lifetime. So that's a lot of sperm that have genetic mutations that are brand new. So those are the ones that are most likely going to have an impact on evolution. Everybody following me here? Okay. Think your mind hurts a little bit. Yeah. This is a little bit more in-depth science than what we usually talk about. All right, so these variations have to be heritable, which basically means passed on to offspring, which is related to the fact that the mutations have to get into the sperm or the eggs in order to be passed along. So the offspring are going to inherit these differences. And the ones that are most likely to have an influence on evolution can be things like differences in color, ability to digest foods. Usually this would be a gain. You gain the ability to digest something that previous generations hadn't been able to digest. We see this with lactose. You probably know that a lot of people are lactose intolerant. They can't digest a particular molecule in milk. But the people who are capable of digesting milk have an advantage in situations of cold winters or moderate famines, because if it's the cold winter, your food supply is running low, but your cow's got milk, that is a protein-packed energy source that will help you get through the winter. That is such a good question. Oh, I love that question. I do not know the answer to that. I just don't know the answer to that. Sorry. It's a good question, though. I'm making myself a note. To hit the Google Scholar after class.
Diana, do we have access to JSTOR through North Shore?
I do not know. Probably not. We have very little in the way of access to scientific documents. Do you need one for your presentation?
No, I just miss it.
Oh, yeah. Unfortunately, North Shore's library is not.
Access to what?
It's a particular scientific journal.
It's more of a database.
I would
paper.
see if your local library might have it.
Scientific papers tend to be inaccessible for almost everyone.
Yeah.
Wow.
Which is a big controversy among scientists right now, or at least scientists who are aware of why that's a problem. But, okay. So, other kinds of mutations. Immune system function is important. Speed, that's one that we think of pretty readily. Eyesight, so birds that developed really good eyesight are the ones that survived to produce more birds with really good eyesight.
Right.
So those are the kinds of things that we see mutations in that tend to be passed on, and evolution acts on those. We also say resources must be limited and competition for those resources. This is where we get the phrase survival of the fittest which is also known as natural selection. So we've got these mutations in our genes. They're heritable, they get passed down. And then any gene that allows an individual to successfully compete for those resources that are limited. So they get the good food, they get the good shelter, they get the good territory, they get the most mates. Whatever mutation gave them that benefit is going to be passed on to the next generation. It's going to become more common in that generation. Those individuals in the next generation who have that mutation are going to be more likely to gain the resources and pass that on until that trait is common throughout the species. And individuals who don't have it are less successful and less likely to reproduce. So when we say fit, we're really talking about fit for the current ecosystem, best able to survive current conditions and to reproduce. So survival of the fittest makes us think fastest, strongest, most aggressive, but it really is the best fit for the ecosystem, the current conditions. And of course, our last one, survival and reproduction have to vary. If all individuals survive and reproduce, there's not going to be any change in the specific genes that are in the next generation. In the real world, not all individuals survive to adulthood, and even those that do, many of them do not reproduce. For wild birds have a relatively high survival rate. This isn't going to sound like it, but 10 to 40% of birds there is JSTOR available. Oh, that's good. Survive to adulthood. It varies between species, things like albatross, ravens, things that have a slower reproductive cycle, who have fewer offspring, a higher percentage of their babies will make it to adulthood. Animals that have lots of offspring tend to have fewer of those offspring survive to adulthood. That's just a general rule across the board.
Does that number include the species who will lay multiple eggs and then only raise one?
No, because they usually neglect, we don't generally consider that as part of this statistic. I'm sure there are some people who would include it and some people who don't, That's the way science is, not everybody agrees. Even if we look at survival to adulthood, not every individual who reaches adulthood reproduces. Males are less likely to reproduce than females, but males are also able to father more offspring than females are able to give birth to or lay eggs for. So what I kind of described for you there was the typical natural selection. This is what most people learn about when we talk about evolution. There are other forms. I mentioned that there are some that are relatively random, and I mentioned genetic drift. I mentioned but did not describe gene flow, and there's also one called bottlenecks. So these are some random processes. Gene flow is when an individual or a small group of individuals from one population of a species moves to a new area where there is a pre-existing population, either of the same species or closely related species that they can interbreed with. Literally, the genes are moving from one population to another. Bottlenecks occur when there is a dramatic decline in the population, and this can be due to diseases or natural disasters. So only a few, relatively few individuals survive. And so you lose a lot of the genetic diversity that used to be in the larger population before it shrank. So you've lost a lot of that genetic information. But what I really want to talk about is sexual selection. And that's because this is something that is very common in birds. So this is the northern cardinal, male and female. This is an example of what is called sexual dimorphism. Oh boy, here's a new big word. DI means two. So my first name, Diana, two Annas. Morph is appearance. So if you're into fish, you may have heard of different color morphs. I've heard some people in the herp industry refer to different strains as morphs. So the
Like
different
fancy is a morph, or a different term, or like a, I think I know what you're talking about, like the different, they have a thing called now called glowfish.
yeah, well, let's ignore glowfish because those are genetically modified organisms. They're GMOs. If you want to think about morphs, you work in a pet store. So how about guppies? They come in, you've got sunset guppies, you've got tuxedo guppies, all of these different strains that have different colors and different size fins. That
Okay,
fit,
so the guppies would be an example.
so guppies,
Sorry.
so those would be examples of different morphs of guppies, different appearances. That's all morph means, is appearance. So sexual dimorphism means the two different sexes have different appearances. Males and females look and or behave noticeably different. We see that in these guys with their color. We'll also see it with songs. We'll see it with behaviors. I'm using the broad terms male and female. Males, what I'm talking about are individuals that have testes, produce sperm, have testosterone. Females, ovary, remember, birds have one, they produce eggs. They're gonna have lower amounts of testosterone and more estrogen. Not every individual fits in each of these categories. Okay. I'm going to stop the share because I want to go looking for something real quick. I meant to put it in. Hang on a second, guys. Here we go. All right, so let's go back to our screen share. And I want to show you this picture. It should be showing up on your screen. So this is one cardinal. The right side of the bird has male coloring. The left side of the bird has female coloring. This sort of thing is relatively common in certain categories of animals. So it's relatively common in birds. We also see it in a lot of insects. But I wanted to bring this one up because I want to reinforce with you guys the idea that male and female, while they're useful terms, they don't define the full spectrum of sexes in any living thing. Is this bird, thank you for that term, Anna, bilateral gynandromorph? Yes, gynandromorph. Bi also means two. Lateral is left and right side. Gyn refers to female, andro male, morph appearance. Is this bird a hermaphrodite? They are not always hermaphrodites, and in fact, I think it's more likely that they're not. But I'm going to use the scientific definition of hermaphrodite. Oh, come on. So a hermaphrodite, why is that not showing up? Okie dokie, come on. Hermaphrodite is specifically an individual that produces both sperm and eggs. So a lot of times when you have these bilateral gynandromorphs, they may or may not have testes and or ovaries. It is significantly rare for someone who is an animal or a person who is this kind of condition, what is more accurately called intersex. They usually, if they have gonads, they may often be deformed or not formed correctly, and they will generally only have one type or the other type, not both. And if they have both, they usually are not successfully able to produce the sperm and the eggs from them, because if they have a testis, that testis is producing high levels of testosterone. If they have an ovary, that ovary is producing high levels of estrogen and progesterone. And so you have the hormones fighting each other. You need high levels of testosterone to successfully produce sperm. You need high levels of estrogen and progesterone to produce eggs. But because you're producing both of those, you've got those hormones in conflict with each other. And so you're not likely to be able to produce both sperm and eggs. Species that do that have evolved to be able to do that. You're not going to find a species that typically has males and females who can produce an intersex individual who is fertile. Basically, they are not going to be fertile. And I'm talking about the vertebrates here. Don't ask me about insects because they do things in a completely different, very strange way. All right. Woo. Okay, so we're going to stop here. You guys have had some great comments and some great questions today. But we're out of time. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about sexual selection more next time. And then we're going to talk about the process of moving from the theropod dinosaurs to the modern day birds. So any questions?
Yes, quick question, when? What is the due date for the project?
The project for this class is due hang on, got a note here. Sunday, April 16th.
16th, okay.
Yep. All right, if that's the only question, I will see you guys on Thursday.
I have a question. I know I emailed you about it. I'm still sort of confused about
Okay.
the difference between the crop and the gizzard and which one is